Welcome, listeners. You are about to hear a captivating mystery, written and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. Prepare to follow the brilliant Sherlock Holmes as he solves a chilling case full of twists and dark secrets. Don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling tales. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, The Vanishing Violin. It was a quiet evening in London, with the usual fog pressing down from the heavens, shrouding the gas lamps in an amber hue. The streets, slick with the persistent drizzle, reflected the pale glow of the light like a city submerged beneath the surface of a murky sea. In the distance, a distant carriage rattled over cobblestone, its sound fading as quickly as it arrived. Nothing about this night, save for its damp chill, seemed out of place. Yet, in the heart of the city, at the residence of Henry Langley, one of London's most celebrated violinists, a darkness was already at work. The estate, a grand building tucked behind the silhouette of fog, stood still. But in the opulent study on the second floor, beneath the heavy velvet curtains, all was far from calm. The body of Henry Langley lay slumped across his desk, an elegant mahogany affair that bore the weight of countless compositions. His once pristine white shirt was stained with a dark liquid that had pooled beneath his body. His face, though serene in death, carried an expression that might have been mistaken for one of shock, if one were to look too closely. His hand, still positioned near a sheet of paper, clutched a pen, a writer's instrument forever tainted by its final stroke. Sherlock Holmes stood in the doorway, the familiar hum of thought already filling his mind, slicing through the confusion of the moment. He had arrived only moments earlier, summoned by the frantic voice of Mrs. Langley, who had discovered her husband's body upon returning from her evening outing. The constable, a well-meaning but clearly overwhelmed man, stood near the door, wringing his hands in a futile attempt to maintain composure. "You'll want to be careful with the scene, Constable," Holmes said in his calm, measured tone, stepping further into the study. His boots made no sound on the plush rug beneath him. "The details here will speak volumes." He approached the desk, eyes scanning every inch of the room. There was no obvious sign of struggle, nothing that suggested a violent altercation. The window was slightly ajar, the cool evening air entering the room with a whisper. It was a detail that might have seemed innocent, except for the careful, deliberate way it had been left open. Had the murderer escaped this way? Or was it simply a distraction, placed to divert attention from the true cause? Holmes's eyes lingered on the desk, moving from the body of Langley to the scattered papers around him. The musician's last moments had been spent in something far less romantic than the music he had mastered. A world of confusion, perhaps, or something worse, a final, calculated decision. Near Langley's right hand, a scrap of paper had been hastily folded and left half exposed. Holmes lifted it gently, his gloved fingers brushing against the worn edges. On the paper, in a jagged hand, was a cryptic message. "The music will play again." Holmes frowned, the first hint of intrigue crossing his face. The words, simple enough, carried weight beyond their meaning. Someone had clearly intended for this message to be discovered. But by whom? And for what purpose? The room, silent, but for the soft clicking of Holmes's boots against the wooden floorboards, seemed to press in on him. The faint scent of rosin lingered in the air, a subtle reminder of Langley's profession. A violinist's rosin, a faint trace left behind like a ghost of a performance. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he focused on the dusted area of the desk. It was subtle, nearly imperceptible, but there it was, a small, faint patch of rosin, carefully wiped, but not quite erased. Not a common enough occurrence to be dismissed. It suggested something, some sort of deliberate act perhaps. But why here, in this place, at this moment? The violin was gone. It had to be. Holmes stood back, his gaze sweeping the room with a quiet intensity. His mind already worked at full capacity, the gears turning, even as the constable fumbled with a series of half-formed questions. "We've gathered the family, Mr. Holmes," the constable said, his voice wavering slightly as he struggled to keep his composure. "His wife, his manager, and a few colleagues. All of them are quite distressed, of course. Holmes nodded absently, his thoughts already elsewhere. "Bring them here. I will need to speak to them all." The constable hesitated, but Holmes's sharp look silenced any objections. He was already in charge. There was no question. He turned his attention back to the body, allowing his mind to wander through the possible scenarios, each more complex than the last. As always, Holmes found himself drawn to the smallest details: the misplaced rosin, the message on the paper, the odd, peaceful death of a man whose life had been marked by fevered public performances and quiet, intimate compositions. Holmes had learned long ago that there were few coincidences in the world of crime, and whatever had led to Langley's death was far from simple. As the heavy door of the study closed behind him, Holmes cast one last glance at the body. His mind already raced ahead, piecing together the puzzle that lay before him. A murder, yes. But who would want Langley dead? And why, in this precise moment, did it seem so deeply personal? Mrs. Langley would have answers, as would the others, but it was clear that the key to understanding this crime lay in a far more intricate place than anyone had yet imagined. The investigation had only just begun. The constable led Sherlock down the narrow hallway to the sitting room, where the various individuals connected to Henry Langley had been gathered. The room was a study in contrasts. Fine china sat atop a polished sideboard, but the tense atmosphere had drained any warmth from the otherwise grand setting. Mrs. Langley, a woman whose delicate beauty had faded under the weight of grief, sat by the fire, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a lace handkerchief. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her composure remained intact. Beside her stood her husband's manager, a middle-aged man with a thin moustache and a sharp, calculating gaze that barely concealed his unease. He did not look as if he had suffered a personal loss, but rather someone who had been caught off guard by a sudden turn of events, one that threatened his livelihood. The room's third occupant was a younger man, a violinist who had once been a rival to Langley, though he now seemed more bewildered than bitter. His hands were clasped tightly in front of him, and he avoided making eye contact, his eyes darting nervously to the door, as if he wished to escape. Holmes surveyed them quietly, his mind already working. The room was filled with the scent of fresh tea, but it did little to mask the tension that hung in the air like a heavy cloud. "I assume you have all been informed of the situation," Holmes began, his voice soft yet steady, pulling all attention to him. His gaze fell first upon Mrs. Langley. "Mrs. Langley, I understand you discovered your husband's body upon returning home." She nodded, her face pale and drawn. "Yes. I don't understand. I left him this afternoon for a brief engagement. He had been working on a new composition, and I thought he'd be at it for hours." Her voice quivered slightly as she spoke, but she composed herself quickly. I never expected—" Her words faltered, and she glanced at her husband's lifeless form across the street. "I don't know who would do such a thing." Holmes did not immediately respond, his sharp eyes taking in every aspect of the woman's demeanour. There was genuine sorrow in her eyes, but also something else. A quiet, almost imperceptible flicker of something hidden. Her grief was palpable, yet something about her story felt incomplete. Turning to the manager, Holmes's gaze was just as unyielding. "Mr. Brooks, I understand you and Mr. Langley had a professional relationship. Can you tell me if there were any recent concerns or conflicts that might have provoked this tragedy?" Brooks straightened, as if the very question demanded a certain dignity, though his voice wavered just slightly. "No, none at all, Mr. Holmes. We were preparing for Langley's next concert tour. Everything was in order, I assure you. He was a genius, but—" He hesitated for a moment, as though searching for the right words. "But perhaps it's better to say he had his moments of frustration. He could be difficult to work with, but nothing unusual. No threats." Holmes nodded, making a note of Brooks' reluctance to explain further. The hesitation was telling. It suggested that while Brooks was determined to maintain an appearance of professionalism, there might have been underlying tensions that he preferred to keep hidden. Finally, Holmes turned his attention to the third man, the violinist who stood near the window, his posture stiff. His name, Holmes knew, was David Fletcher, once a promising talent who had disappeared from the public eye after Langley had eclipsed him. Their rivalry had been a subject of whispered gossip in the music world. Fletcher was the one Holmes had not yet spoken to. "Mr. Fletcher, I assume you were acquainted with the late Mr. Langley?" Holmes inquired. His voice was deliberate, the slight edge of suspicion in his words tempered by an air of politeness. "I trust you have no personal grievances with him?" Fletcher's eyes flickered, an unmistakable flicker of discomfort passing across his face. "I knew him, yes," he said, his voice tight. "But we had not spoken in quite some time." His eyes dropped to the floor, and his fingers fidgeted at his sides. "We were rivals, yes, but there's no reason for anyone to think—" He cut himself off abruptly, as though he realized he had said too much. Holmes's gaze was sharp, his mind piecing together the subtle, telltale signs of guilt. Fletcher had been evasive, but it was the way he avoided eye contact that piqued Holmes's curiosity. And the fact that he had not protested more vehemently at the idea of personal grievances suggested that perhaps there was something to be unearthed. Holmes let the silence stretch, allowing the discomfort in the room to settle. "Tell me, Mr. Fletcher," he said at last, his tone soft. "What was your relationship with Mr. Langley like toward the end of his life? Were there any signs of trouble? Any indication that he had fallen into some sort of crisis?" Fletcher shifted uneasily, but finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know," he said. "He was a genius, but genius can be a burden. He was obsessed with something that no one knew about. He became distant, secretive. I don't know what it was, but there was something. And when he stopped playing at his peak, that's when the rumors started." He hesitated again, his words coming slower now. Perhaps there was something more to his disappearance." Holmes raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "Disappearance? I was unaware of Mr. Langley vanishing." Fletcher's face drained of colour, his lips trembling slightly. No, not like that," he said quickly. "It was just... He had moments, you see. He would go off alone, sometimes for hours, sometimes days. It was as though he was trying to escape from something." Holmes's mind raced. It was not just a matter of a rivalry gone wrong or a matter of jealousy. Langley had been hiding something that only a select few knew about, something that perhaps could explain his sudden death. The conversation shifted and meandered for a time, but Holmes kept returning to the same unsettling thought. Langley had been murdered, yes. But more than that, he had been murdered in a way that hinted at a deeper, far more personal involvement. Someone in this room knew more than they were letting on. The investigation had already begun to take on a weight of its own. In the days following Langley's death, Sherlock Holmes found himself caught in a labyrinth of contradictions. Every lead he followed seemed to branch into two more, each as unclear and fraught with misdirection as the last. Holmes sat at his usual seat in his Baker Street office, the fire crackling softly in the hearth as the late afternoon sun filtered through the blinds. His fingers absent-mindedly twirled his magnifying glass, a sharp contrast to the calm, calculated nature of his thoughts. Watson, who had been observing the case closely, sat opposite him, scribbling down notes in his medical journal as Holmes processed the unfolding web of intrigue. "The violin," Holmes murmured, tapping the edge of his glass thoughtfully. "It must have some significance. I can't shake the feeling that it's more than just a symbol of his profession. The piece left on Langley's desk, the faint rosin traces, it wasn't accidental." He paused, glancing up at Watson. "But there's more here, Watson. More than a simple robbery or a crime of passion." Watson placed his pen down with a soft clink, his gaze sharpening. "You suspect the violin wasn't just taken for its value, then?" Holmes gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Precisely. Whoever took it had a specific purpose in mind. But why would they take only the violin and leave the rest of the valuables? The answer, I believe, lies not in the violin itself, but in what it represents. The conversation drifted then to the details of the past few days. Holmes had spoken with each of the suspects, yet every conversation seemed to obscure the truth further, rather than clarify it. He had visited Langley's home again and again, his keen eyes scanning every corner, every discarded paper. Each time, it felt as though the house itself was guarding its secrets, refusing to give up what it knew. It was a cool, overcast morning when Holmes and Watson visited the antique shop where the missing violin had allegedly turned up. The shop was nestled between two grand buildings on a quiet street, and the bell above the door chimed with a soft tinkle as they entered. The musty smell of aged wood and leather filled the air, but it wasn't the shop's disarray that caught Holmes's attention. It was the violin itself. The shopkeeper, a thin, nervous-looking man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, stood behind the counter, wiping his hands with a rag. His eyes darted toward them as they approached. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" His voice was thin, almost apologetic, as though he were preparing for an interrogation. Holmes didn't respond immediately. His gaze was fixed on the violin on the counter, its wood dulled with age, the strings frayed, the varnish chipped. It was unmistakably Langley's violin, the craftsmanship, the wear, the unmistakable history behind it. Yet something about it was off. It had been damaged, severely in fact, its neck cracked, and the body scratched. "This is the violin that was taken from Langley's estate?" Holmes asked, his voice even, his eyes narrowing slightly. The shopkeeper nodded, wringing the rag in his hands. "Yes, sir. A man. Tall. Thin. He came in just a few days ago. Said he was looking to sell it. Needed the money. He wasn't in here for long. Just long enough to get the price." Holmes leaned forward, inspecting the violin with the practiced eye of a professional. His fingers traced the damage, noting the odd manner in which it had been broken, almost as if someone had tried to force it apart. "Tell me more about this man," Holmes said, his voice growing sharper, more direct. The shopkeeper hesitated, his brow furrowing as he tried to recall the details. He didn't give a name, not at first. He looked nervous, kept glancing over his shoulder, as though someone might be watching him. I didn't think much of it at the time, but when he left I noticed the way he walked. Limped, you see. Quite peculiar, the way he carried himself. Holmes stood back, his eyes scanning the shop with precision. "You didn't think it unusual that someone would bring in such a renowned item for a simple transaction?" "Well?" The shopkeeper's voice trailed off. "I didn't think it was my place to question him. I just did the business. It wasn't until later that I realized what I'd been given." Holmes's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles, though there was no humor in it. "Indeed," he murmured. "I trust you didn't offer the man any money for the violin?" No, the shopkeeper responded quickly. "It was too damaged, you see. I wasn't about to pay him much for it. Just a small fee for taking it off his hands." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And this man, did you get a good look at him? A description, perhaps?" The shopkeeper fumbled with the rag in his hands. "Tall, dark hair, I think. Wore a coat that was too large for him. I don't know. It was all too quick. I didn't get a good look at his face." Holmes stood there for a long moment, digesting the information. The man was elusive, almost too perfect in his avoidance. But his limp, the odd manner in which he walked, this, Holmes knew, was a clue, albeit a subtle one. The search for the violin's mysterious buyer led Holmes and Watson into the heart of the city's less reputable quarters. They interviewed several street vendors, delved into back-alley pawn shops, and spoke to more than a few unsavoury characters. Each lead proved to be a dead end, however. There were whispers of a man fitting the description, but none that could be definitively tied to the purchase of Langley's violin. It was only after several days of fruitless searching that Holmes received an unexpected visit at his office. Mrs. Langley had returned, her face drawn and pale, but her eyes determined. "I know where my husband's violin is," she said, her voice barely a whisper, as if afraid to speak the words aloud. "I've seen it." Holmes looked up, his interest piqued. "Where?" Mrs. Langley's gaze shifted to the floor. "It's in the hands of someone I thought I could trust." The fire in the hearth crackled, casting long shadows across the study as Holmes leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Mrs. Langley. The room was still, save for the soft hiss of the flames and the occasional rustle of paper as Watson flipped through his notes. The news that Mrs. Langley had seen the violin was, to say the least, a breakthrough. It was the first real lead Holmes had had in days that had stretched into weeks of nothing but frustration and dead ends. Holmes took a measured breath, carefully analysing Mrs. Langley's nervous posture. She sat near the edge of the chair, her fingers wrapped tightly around the lace handkerchief she had been clutching since her arrival. Her eyes were red, her face pale, as though the weight of what she was about to reveal had drained the life from her. Yet, there was a determination in her gaze now, a quiet resolve that hadn't been there when she first entered. "I've seen it," she repeated, her voice trembling. "The violin. It was in the hands of someone who shouldn't have had it." Holmes's gaze softened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "Tell me, Mrs. Langley, who was it? Who had the violin?" She hesitated, glancing at Watson before finally speaking. "It was Mr. Brooks, my husband's manager. I saw him at the antique shop, standing with the violin in his hands. I thought it was odd, at the time. He told me it was for safekeeping, that he had come to ensure its protection. But her voice faltered. "But I know now, it wasn't about that. He knew something about my husband's death. He had to have." Holmes sat back, his mind racing. Brooks, Langley's manager, had been an enigmatic figure in this case. Polished, smooth, and unnervingly composed, Brooks had hidden his unease well when Holmes had questioned him. But now, with this new revelation, a crack had appeared in his carefully constructed facade. "You are certain it was Brooks you saw?" Holmes asked, his voice low, measured. "Not another man?" Mrs. Langley nodded fervently. "It was him, Mr. Holmes. I would know him anywhere. And the look in his eyes, he was trying to hide something." Holmes pressed his fingers to his temple, his mind working through the implications. Brooks had always seemed too calm, too in control. But if he had been hiding something, this could explain the layers of misdirection in the investigation. The violin wasn't just an item of value. It was a key to the entire mystery. "The shopkeeper," Holmes murmured to himself. "He spoke of a man with a limp. Brooks, does he walk with a limp?" Mrs. Langley's eyes widened. "No, he does not. But I believe he may have been trying to distance himself from the scene, to appear unconnected. Mr. Holmes, there's more. I've seen him in the company of a woman, someone he was trying to keep secret. It was in the days leading up to Henry's death. A woman who I think may have been part of this all." Holmes looked up sharply. "A woman?" His mind immediately turned over the possibilities, trying to make sense of the connection. "Who is she? What was her role?" Mrs. Langley shifted in her seat, her voice growing softer now, hesitant. "I don't know her name, but I saw them together more than once, whispering, speaking in hushed tones as though they didn't want to be overheard. And the way Brooks looked at her, it was as though he was hiding something important." Holmes stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Watson, we need to visit Brooks, immediately." The night air was sharp, as Holmes and Watson made their way through the dark streets toward the office of Langley's manager, Mr. Brooks. The city was eerily quiet under the cover of fog, the gas lamps casting pools of yellow light on the pavement. The smell of wet stone mingled with the faint scent of burning wood in the distance. It was a night where nothing felt quite right, where every shadow seemed to hold something just out of reach, something yet to be uncovered. They arrived at Brooks' office, the door slightly ajar, as if inviting them in. Holmes knocked once, the sound echoing through the stillness of the night. No answer. A second knock. Still nothing. Holmes's brow furrowed. "There is no answer, but we know he is in there," Holmes muttered. "Come, Watson. Let us make our own entrance." With a swift motion, Holmes reached for the door handle and turned it, stepping inside without hesitation. The office was dimly lit, a single oil lamp flickering on a desk that sat at the far side of the room. Bookshelves lined the walls, and a fine rug covered the floor, but there was no sign of Brooks. "Mr. Brooks?" Holmes called, his voice calm but carrying a weight of authority that demanded attention. There was no immediate response, but the soft shuffle of footsteps from the rear of the office caught Holmes's keen ears. A figure appeared in the doorway of an adjoining room. A tall man, dressed in a dark suit, his face as smooth and unreadable as ever. It was Brooks, though his eyes were slightly wider than usual, his demeanour a touch more guarded. "Mr. Holmes?" he said, his voice steady, but Holmes could sense the tension beneath it. "What is it that brings you here at this hour?" Holmes stepped into the room, his gaze never leaving Brooks. "I believe you know exactly why I am here, Mr. Brooks. It seems you have something of great interest to me, something of far greater importance than you've led me to believe." Brooks straightened, his jaw tightening. "I have no idea what you mean. I've already given you everything you need." Holmes's lips curled into a faint smile, his eyes gleaming with quiet intensity. "No, Mr. Brooks, you've given me half-truths and misdirection. The violin that was stolen, for instance. The one you brought to the antique shop. How did you come to possess it?" Brooks froze, his eyes flicking to the side, betraying the smallest crack in his composure. "Answer me," Holmes insisted. "What have you been hiding, Mr. Brooks?" Brooks shifted uncomfortably, but it was the briefest of pauses before he spoke. I didn't mean for things to go this far, Holmes. Before Brooks could finish, Holmes interrupted. "You've already gone too far, Mr. Brooks. The violin, the woman, your connection to Langley's death. You will tell me everything now." The air in Mr. Brooks's office had grown thick, oppressive, with a tension that could be cut with a knife. The silence between Holmes and Brooks was almost unbearable, as the two men stood facing each other across the dimly lit room. Holmes, ever calm and composed, had the upper hand, but there was something about Brooks now, something darker, that made the hairs on the back of Holmes's neck stand at attention. Brooks's hand twitched toward his jacket pocket, and Holmes's eyes followed the movement. A subtle shift, but enough for Holmes to understand that the man was about to do something desperate. "You don't understand, Holmes," Brooks said, his voice shaky, but tinged with an underlying anger. "You think you know everything, that you can just unravel it all. But you're wrong. I wasn't the only one involved. I was trying to protect her, protect us both." Holmes's brow furrowed, his mind racing to make sense of the cryptic words. "Who are you protecting, Brooks? The woman you spoke of? Tell me her name." Brooks' eyes flashed with something akin to fear, and he stepped back, his hand still hovering near his pocket. "It doesn't matter now. Nothing matters anymore. You think you've figured it out, but you're so far from the truth you don't even realize it." Watson, who had been standing quietly near the doorway, shifted uneasily. His instincts, honed over years of working with Holmes, screamed that something was terribly wrong. He took a step forward, a hand instinctively resting on his medical bag, though he knew there was little he could do in a confrontation like this. Holmes took a deliberate step toward Brooks, his gaze unwavering. "I suggest you start speaking clearly, Mr. Brooks. Your games are over. The violin, the affair, the poison, you've been hiding far more than you realize." For a brief moment, Brooks's eyes darted to the door behind him, his hand still lingering near his coat. Holmes's mind snapped into full alert, and he instinctively braced for what came next. But before he could move, there was a soft click, followed by a sharp hiss of air. Holmes turned just in time to see a dart whiz past his face, embedding itself into the wooden panel behind him. His reflexes, honed from years of danger, kicked in immediately. With a swift motion, he stepped aside, his sharp eyes scanning the room for the source. Brooks' face had gone pale, his eyes wild as he looked at the dart now embedded in the wall. His hand had dropped from his coat, and the gleam of panic was unmistakable in his features. "You," Holmes began, his voice low and steady, though beneath it lay a thread of tension. "You were attempting to poison me, weren't you?" Brooks didn't answer, but his face told the entire story. He had come far too close, and now there was no turning back. "Why the desperation, Mr. Brooks?" Holmes asked. His voice had softened, a careful precision in each syllable. "Why resort to poison, to threats? You were always so careful before, until you found yourself cornered." Brooks' chest heaved as he struggled to maintain his composure, the panic evident now. "You don't know anything. You don't understand what she's capable of. His words faltered as the door to the office creaked open, and in stepped a figure who, until that moment, had remained hidden in the shadows of the conversation. A woman, tall, elegant, and dressed in a dark velvet gown, stepped into the room, her movements smooth, almost calculated. Her dark hair fell in waves over her shoulders, and her eyes, sharp and calculating, met Holmes's without flinching. It was her, the woman Mrs. Langley had mentioned, the one whose presence had been so carefully concealed. The moment she entered, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier, the temperature dropping as her gaze swept over the three men. The tension in the room thickened, and Holmes's eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of her. "Mr. Holmes?" the woman said, her voice smooth, almost mocking. "I trust you're not here for a mere chat." Holmes stood still, his mind calculating the scene in front of him. "You must be the woman Brooks has been hiding. But tell me, why go to such lengths to keep yourself hidden? What part did you play in Langley's death?" The woman smiled, a cool, controlled smile that never quite reached her eyes. "I had no part in his death," she replied, her tone dripping with an unsettling calm. "But I did have something to gain from it, and as you can see, the pieces are already falling into place." Brooks, who had been silent since her entrance, now spoke up, his voice thick with desperation. "You have to understand, Holmes. I was protecting her. She didn't ask for this. But when you started asking questions, I had no choice. I didn't think you'd be this relentless." Holmes's gaze shifted between the two, his mind piecing together the fragments of information now laid bare before him. The woman had been hiding behind the scenes, and Brooks had been her accomplice, drawn into a web of manipulation. But there was still a missing piece to the puzzle. "You protected her," Holmes repeated slowly, his eyes narrowing. "But why, Mr. Brooks? Why go this far for her? And what is it that you believe she stands to gain?" The woman's smile deepened, a small, satisfied twist of the lips. Mr. Langley's death was not only about money or love. It was about something far greater, something far more dangerous. Holmes was silent for a moment, piecing together her words. "What is it that you think I don't understand, then?" The woman's voice dropped to a whisper, her words chilling as they filled the space between them. "You don't understand that some secrets are worth killing for. And that, Mr. Holmes, is the answer you seek." Before Holmes could respond, Brooks lunged at him, a sudden, desperate move that sent the chair behind him crashing to the floor. Holmes, anticipating the action, ducked just in time, stepping aside to avoid the attack. The moment was fleeting, but long enough for Watson to spring into action. The room exploded into chaos. Holmes deftly avoided another swing from Brooks, while Watson moved swiftly to intercept him. A dangerous game of cat and mouse had begun, and only one question remained. Would Holmes be able to untangle the twisted web before they both paid the price? The quiet of the office returned only after a tense, breathless moment. Holmes had avoided Brooks' desperate lunges with practiced precision, but it was Watson who had finally managed to restrain the manager, his grip firm around Brooks' wrists as the man struggled in vain. The woman, silent as ever, stood motionless, her eyes darting from Holmes to the now subdued Brooks. Holmes straightened, brushing the dust from his coat with a single deliberate motion. The room had descended into a stillness that felt almost surreal. The chaos of moments ago was now nothing more than a fleeting memory, and in its place, a deeper, darker truth had begun to emerge. Turning to the woman, Holmes fixed her with a steady gaze. "Now, madam, I believe it's time for you to speak. You've been an enigma from the very beginning, but your role in all of this has been made clear. I want the truth. Who are you, and why was Langley's death necessary?" The woman didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, her posture regal, yet weary. She looked at Holmes with an almost pitying expression, as though she had already accepted the inevitability of the situation. "You're correct, Mr. Holmes. I am, in fact, the person behind all of this. But I think you'll find the true answer far more complicated than you realize." Her voice was calm, too calm, as though the weight of her confession had been long anticipated. She glanced toward Brooks, whose head hung low, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his guilt. This wasn't just about Langley, or even the violin. It was about something far more intricate, something hidden beneath the layers of his public life. Holmes watched her carefully, his mind churning through the possibilities. The pieces were finally falling into place, yet there was still something elusive about her words. "Go on," Holmes urged, his voice sharp but controlled. "Explain it to me. Why murder, and why use the violin as a pawn in this game?" The woman's eyes darkened, and her lips pressed into a thin line. Langley wasn't just a musician. He was a keeper of secrets. Secrets that could ruin the very people who had elevated him. There were things he knew about powerful people. And when he became a liability, that's when we were forced to act. Watson, standing to the side, shifted uneasily. He had no love for the woman, but there was something chilling in her composed demeanor. It was clear that Langley's death had not been the result of a sudden outburst or passion, but of a cold, calculated decision to protect a much larger operation. Langley's knowledge of certain individuals, businessmen, politicians, they couldn't afford to let him speak, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I was brought in to ensure his silence, and ultimately, his death. Holmes nodded slowly, piecing together the final threads. The violin, the cryptic message, everything now made sense. The murder had never been about jealousy or greed. It had been about control. Langley's death had been the culmination of a long, orchestrated plan to ensure that the secrets he held would never see the light of day. "You were the one pulling the strings," Holmes said, his voice steady, his eyes never leaving hers. "Brooks was merely a pawn, a willing participant in a game much larger than either of you." The woman smiled, a faint, almost sorrowful expression that conveyed no true remorse. "We all have our roles to play, Mr. Holmes, and sometimes the cost of keeping those secrets is more than one can bear. But that was the price of survival." Brooks, who had been silent for a long moment, finally raised his head. His voice, when it came, was hoarse, laden with regret. "I never wanted any of this. She said we could avoid trouble if we followed the plan. But I was wrong. I should have never listened." Holmes's gaze softened ever so slightly as he turned toward the manager. "The truth, Mr. Brooks, is that you knew from the start. You knew what you were doing, even if you tried to convince yourself otherwise." The woman, clearly unshaken by the exchange, stepped closer to the desk, her gaze never leaving Holmes. "What will you do now, Mr. Holmes? What happens to us?" Holmes glanced briefly at Watson, whose expression was a mixture of concern and disbelief. It was clear that there was little left to say. The truth had been uncovered, but the consequences were inevitable. "We will ensure that your involvement is known," Holmes said, his voice cold, but not without finality. "But for you, there will be no escape from the consequences of your actions." As the officers arrived to take them into custody, Holmes and Watson stood in the dim light of the office, the weight of the case finally settling upon them. The truth had come to light, but it had come at a price. Outside, the fog had lifted, and the sky above was a pale grey. The streets of London seemed quieter now, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Holmes stared out the window for a long moment, lost in thought, his eyes narrowing as the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Langley's murder had been a tragic necessity for those involved, but as always, the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it was buried. And Holmes, with his sharp mind and quiet determination, had once again proven that even the darkest secrets could not remain hidden forever. Turning away from the window, he adjusted his coat and looked toward Watson. "Another case closed, Watson," he said, his voice calm, his expression unreadable. "But the game never truly ends, does it?" Watson smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "No, I suppose it never does." And with that, the two of them left the office, stepping into the cool, crisp air of London's morning. The case had ended, but the mystery, as always, remained just a little deeper than before.